Hello friends, welcome to my new reading chair. We're here because I'm not feeling too great today. My asthma's been playing up and I just feel like being comfy. I hope the lighting's okay, it's a bit tricky with the window, but today we are doing my July reading wrap up. So let's start with some stats. As usual, I'm getting these from the Story Graph because they make my graphs for me and I don't have to fuck around with a spreadsheet. So far this month I have read 13 books for a total of 3,354 pages. 3 of those books have been audio copies that I've gotten from Libro FM's ALC program. The rest are physical copies that I own. For the moods I've been reading, apparently I've been sticking to reflective, emotional and sad. There's a dash of hopeful in there too. That's nice to see. Now my pacing has switched up a little, if you can even say that. I've read less slow-paced books than I have medium. That's a first in a while. Still no fast-paced books though. Then for the number of pages for each book, most of the books that I've read are under 300 pages. About a quarter, a little less than a quarter, are the 300 to 500 page category. None over 500 pages though. I read mostly fiction with about a third non-fiction as well. And as per usual, my genre list is kind of it's all over the place because I read a lot of different stuff. I read 5 contemporary books, 2 in the LGBTQIA+ category, 2 in the YA category, 2 literary, 2 fantasy, and then a bunch of other ones. Now, as for my ratings, it's been a bit of a wild month. My average rating is 3.65, which I think is pretty average-ish. And I had 5 books with 5 stars, but I did also give my second 1 star of the year. I don't give 1 stars very often, but I had a 1 star this month. Now in these videos, I do sort of rank them, maybe not exactly, but I talk about the books within the star category. So we start with the 1 stars and we move up to the 5 stars. So these videos do start out a little negative. I'm sorry about that, but I promise I gush about books by the end of the video. So let's start with the 1 star review. This is Mona at Sea by Elizabeth Gonzalez James. I got this on audiobook through Libro FM's ALC program. Thank you, Libro FM. I did not like this book. I put it on as just something to listen to while I sort of went about and did some errands the other day. I was had to go to the post office and I was out of the house for a few hours. So I put an audiobook on. And I was looking forward to this one. I liked the title. I don't know, it sounded interesting. It was the synopsis is that it's about a millennial in 2009, so after the GFC, or I think in America you guys called it the Great Depression. And she's just finished college and she was got accepted into some big fancy job as a banker, but then the GFC and the recession hit. So she ended up unemployed and having to live with her parents, and she was not happy about it. So an interesting premise. Why did I hate this book? To start with, the main character, I've forgotten her name, she is hugely stereotypical, almost to the point where I thought a boomer had written this. She was entitled, as entitled as it comes. She was self-absorbed, she was selfish, she was rude, she was obnoxious. She was just everything you read in those what's wrong with millennials think pieces from 10 years ago. She was that. I don't know, she thinks she's better than everyone and everything. And it's just unpleasant to read. She's also just kind of nasty to her friends and begs for their forgiveness, but multiple times. I also didn't like the romance, but if you know me, you know I don't give 1 stars to books unless I feel like there's something that would actively make me not recommend a book. This book just made me a bit mad, in particular in how it dealt with self-harm. And so trigger warning for this book, there is explicit on-page, quite frequent, repeated cutting episodes that the character goes through. What I did not like about this depiction was just how much this book romanticized the self-harm. And I honestly thought we were past this. This read some of the shit you used to see on Tumblr about how cool self-harm is. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. But there are multiple times throughout this book by multiple different characters who comment on the self-harm or who interact with the self-harm in some way. And I don't know how else to put it, but it's romanticized. And to me, that's sick. I don't know how to talk about this without being a little bit explicit. So if you're not into this, please jump ahead. I'll put a timestamp here where I stop talking about this book. But basically how she's cutting herself is she's creating over the period of 4 years, a piece of art. She's creating the Mona Lisa, and she does it over 4 years, the same length of time that Leonardo da Vinci took to make his, masterpiece. And at one point, she shows this artwork her scars to somebody, and he thinks they're beautiful, wants to photograph them. They end up becoming a piece of art that is celebrated. And on top of that, at one point, another character who finds out about it, he compares it to like scarification rituals in different cultures throughout the world. Obviously, I found this uncomfortable, but I found like her actual participation in self-harm in terms of like why she was doing it. I think that part of the character made sense. But then all this extra stuff of it being artwork, not only she creating art, but then people seeing it as her masterpiece, of using it to elevate somebody else's artistic career. And then the way that it was spoken about by her father as if it was comparable to, you know, like a coming of age ceremony. Like it just, I'm not okay with that kind of romanticization, you know what I mean? I didn't like it. I did not like it. Now I had one 2-star book, and that was Nobody's Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. I was really looking forward to this, in part because I liked the cover. And then also I saw Lena Norms talking about it. I really love Lena Norms and her channel. And she was talking about how this is kind of like a book written by someone who actually uses the internet, which is not very common. For some reason, authors love to brag about how they don't use social media, but then include social media in their books and wonder why it comes off cringy. So I was excited. As someone who is very online, I was looking forward to this book. It sort of reads almost as tweets, like long form tweets at the beginning, which are like demonstrate this in-joke sort of performative like shared language thing that the internet has going on. The second half, it sort of just like switches up when something happens in the main character's family to sort of like take her out of the internet world. And all of a sudden she has to be very present with her family, and just sort of like how that changes how she thinks, what she thinks about, and how she communicates what she's thinking. I think what it did well was sort of juxtapose the sort of immediate reactionary nature of being online with more intimate, small moments of connection. But then on top of that, I also think there is some like commentary on how much the internet can sort of like dehumanize people, like in terms of the humor and the discussion that is often sort of perpetuated, especially on Twitter. I feel like this is especially commenting on Twitter, even if it's not named. There's a lot of dehumanization in the sort of language that's used, in the way that people talk about people and events. It's very detached, it's absurd, it's like ironic. And so I think she's sort of putting a spotlight on that, but then also how that interaction can dehumanize us as well. Rather than this being a commentary like the author was hoping on the internet itself, to me it more read as a commentary on the internet, the part of the internet that this character and perhaps the author choose to participate in. Like when a bunch of people are dehumanizing someone on the internet for lols, there are people there being like, hey, that's not cool. Like the idea that we're all, like it's a big groupthink exercise. I mean, I don't know, maybe she's in a bit more of an echo chamber than she thought. And I don't know, I just didn't feel like there was a lot of self-awareness of that, I guess, of like that you can choose how you participate in the internet. Maybe there's more to this book because people are really celebrating it as like genre defying and brilliant. I can see elements of that, but I don't know, for me it just kind of missed the mark. Now for our 2.5-star books. So these are the books that I enjoyed some element of, but ultimately, I don't know, there was something that just didn't connect or just didn't work for me. First I'll talk about An Emotion of Great Delight. This I also got actually the audiobook through Libra FM. And what to say about this book? I think it was the first book that I read of the month, so it's been quite a while since I even really thought about this, to be honest. But I do remember it was a YA set just after 9/11, and the main character that we follow is a young Muslim girl at school. And so she's obviously sort of dealing with not only just like school drama and friends and that sort of stuff, but also the sort of like extra heightened level of xenophobia, Islamophobia and racism that was so prevalent in the United States, especially in that moment after 9/11. And so a really powerful, interesting sort of premise. And I do think that this novel dealt with quite beautifully the sort of complexities of grief that this character went through. Like she is an American, and so she's grieving the experience of 9/11 just as much as any other American. But on top of that, she's also grieving for her friends and family, and extended family that still live in the countries that are now being attacked by the United States. And she's also grieving the fact that now she is being targeted and treated as if she doesn't belong in a place that she's lived her whole life. So there's a lot of complex emotions that are explored, I think, really beautifully. It's also one of those sort of novels that like everything that could go wrong for a character does. Like there's a lot happening here for this character. So it's a difficult one to get through. It's heavy. However, a couple of things really didn't work for me. One, the romance in this. I just really don't like romances where like the first moment of passion happens when one character is obviously like hugely devastated and experiencing like a heightened level of trauma. And like the moment of like their first connection, their first intimate moment is like what should just be a moment of comfort, you know, like that person needs comfort, and instead it like escalates to physical intimacy or like a confession of love, whatever it is. I don't like books that do that. To me, it feels kind of cheap. It also feels a bit, I don't want to say predatory, but like it feels exploitative. Like if somebody needs a hug and needs to talk and needs to see a therapist, like they're not in the right space for you to be making a move, mate, you know? And also as someone who's been involved in mental health advocacy, especially with young people, I just don't love to see YA that sort of romanticizes to any extent a young person like shouldering the burdens of other people, especially of parents and family members, to the point where it like emotionally breaks them. And a lot of books do this. I worry about it a bit more in YA in particular. And finally, it's a very short book, and the ending in particular felt very rushed. So at the end of the day, this is a book that I just feel really conflicted about. It was quite beautiful and moving. I cried. It was pretty heavy hitting. Like I said, just pretty much anything that could go wrong for this character does. And it's sad. But there was also just like a lot of elements, whether it be tropes or how something was tackled, that I just didn't really like, that didn't work for me. Next up was Cherry Beach by Laura McPhee Brown. This is a book that I've really been looking forward to. I can't remember where I saw the recommendation, but I did see it recommended for people who loved Friends in Dark Shapes by Kavita Bedford, which is one of my favourite books of the year. So I had high hopes for this. Plus I think the cover's really pretty. I will say I loved the writing in this. I think it was really sort of specific. It was almost musical sometimes. It felt really like intimate and vulnerable, and I don't know, I just thought it was beautiful. This book is basically about two best friends. It's two young women who have grown up best friends. It's Hetty and Ness. And after Hetty has sort of had, you know, a big breakup with a not very nice boyfriend, they both decide to move to Canada together from Melbourne. And so this story sort of starts once they get to Canada. They like share a bed. They live like in very close quarters. They're very, very like close friends. Ness, how do I put this? More or less like puts Hetty up onto some weird pedestal, to the point where she kind of dehumanizes her in a way that's sort of uncomfortable. She's sort of obsessed with her and thinks she's amazing. And she's in love with her, but in a way that sort of infantilizes Hetty as well, which I don't know, I didn't really like. It didn't feel passionate and moving and sad and like longing. It felt kind of weird and creepy. Just in the way that she sort of spoke about Hetty and like imagined Hetty. On top of that, Ness was a very passive narrator and main character. Everything just sort of happens to her. She's not really involved in making anything in the plot happen. And so in that way, it's sort of a bit boring. And I think the thing that I struggled most with, even though I did enjoy the reading experience overall, the thing that I struggled with was that Hetty sort of declines in a mental health crisis. And the sort of suggestion, it might have even been quite explicit by a character or two by the end, is that you kind of can't help somebody who's mentally unwell. And that what happens to them is inevitable. So that was shit. And ultimately, I do feel like the characters felt very two-dimensional. And with a story that's very much focused on the relationship of two people, and that's sort of what the whole thing's about, I don't know, it just fell pretty flat for me. So no 3-star books, let's jump to the 3.5-star books. The first one was You Exist Too Much by Arafat, which I did read for the Palestine Reading Challenge. So I've spoken a lot about this book in that video, and I will leave a link to that in the description box below and the cards above if you'd like to see that. But just to sort of briefly recap, this is a book about a Palestinian American who is also bisexual, and we follow her through some different relationships. Basically, she's demonstrating quite a lot of patterns and cycles of unhealthy behavior in her relationships. And she ends up going into, I'm not sure if she calls it rehab, but a hospital setting to sort of confront some of her like codependent behaviors and her, I think she calls it relationship addiction. It was very easy to read in terms of the writing itself. It was almost read like a YA at times, although the themes are certainly adult. And I did like how sensitive the author felt in terms of how she approached and tackled some really challenging and difficult topics. And so even if I didn't like love the main character, I did care about her. Next was Transcendent Kingdom, and I've heard this author's name pronounced so many different ways at this point that I'm not sure. The most common one that I've seen is Gyasi, but then in the audiobook I think it was Jasi. So if anybody knows for sure, please let me know in the comments. This was an interesting book. It feels like a lot of other books that I've read, but its specific themes were very different from other books that I've read. So it follows a main character, Gifty, I think her name was, and she is a scientist, but she also comes from a very religious family, and she herself was very religious growing up and very invested in Christianity. So I think it explored how those two elements of this character's life and experience were at once so opposing and yet came together for her. And I think it did that really well and really beautifully. The other thing I found really moving about this book was how it explored mental illness and addiction in particular, and substance abuse. The main character's brother ends up becoming addicted to painkillers after an injury playing sport. And the sort of journey that he goes on and that the main character has to sort of watch him go on is harrowing. And on top of that, how her family experienced that addiction in the context of them being Black and being migrants in especially the religious community that they were a part of. I think that was a really interesting discussion. This is also an audiobook that I got from Libra FM's ALC program. Then I also read a manga. I haven't read a manga in a little while, and it is In This Corner of the World. It's such a pretty cover. This is an absolutely beautifully drawn manga. The artwork is stunning in this, and it is about a young girl who becomes a young woman. We follow her for quite a few years, and her family in Japan at the time of World War II. But what was especially touching about this was that it really focused on the small everyday moments with these characters. It wasn't sort of like dramatized or like it wasn't overdone at all. We follow these characters for many years in the lead up to World War II and then throughout World War II. And it really is just about a bunch of people trying to get through everyday life. And as that life gets harder, you know, with harder access to healthcare and even, not being able to travel to see family members on trains, obviously rations and stuff of that nature. And then as things get worse and kind of come into their area in terms of the conflict, how that sort of just like plays out in terms of how they just, they try to just get by. It's obviously harrowing. It's obviously really sad. But the main character at the heart of this is a really warm, sweet, generous, kind, and ultimately quite hopeful character. So it never feels like so bleak. Now I have one 4-star book, and that was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. I've read quite a few Jacqueline Woodson books now, 3 or 4, and I always really, really like them. Although everything else I've read of hers has been fiction. This, though, is Jacqueline Woodson's own story. Mostly it's from when she's like a young girl. And it is basically about Jacqueline Woodson coming of age during the civil rights movement. And it is beautifully done. There's a lot of focus on family, loss, grief, and religion, as well as race. And I think what Jacqueline Woodson did so well here is it didn't feel like adult Jacqueline Woodson was looking back and telling us what she remembered. It felt like she'd managed to capture the voice of a young girl and the perspective of a young girl really, really well. And I think in particular, the way that she embodied that childhood innocence and how she then came into contact with or first started conceptualizing issues like racism and the racism she was experiencing, or the grief and loss of family members, sort of like how well she captured that innocence in a child coming into contact with these things for the first time and trying to understand them, trying to make sense of them, trying to make meaning out of them, was so impactful. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. It was really well done. And then my five-star books. Oh, these were good. The first one I'll talk about is a book that barely fits in the frame. It is When We Say Black Lives Matter by Maxine Beneba Clark. This is a children's book that Maxine put out last year in response to the elevation of Black Lives Matter, the movement, and its prominence in media, and her sort of wanting to be able to explain what children, especially young Black children, were seeing on the news, and trying to explain to them, you know, why people were chanting Black Lives Matter, what that phrase meant, but also why it was important and why it was necessary and is necessary. And I think the way in particular that she sort of managed to explain why Black Lives Matter exists, like the history that has led up to this movement, but then also like why it's relevant and still important today. But she balances all that with this really empowering message as well. There's a lot of celebration of Blackness in here too, which I think is really important for children to read and to hear. Next, the shortest book that I read this month was Tangled Up in Black, A Journey Through Education and History by Gary Foley. And there is also, I guess, I don't know what you call it, a foreword by Tony Birch. Now, anyone who knows me knows that Gary Foley is one of my favorite people on the planet. He was and continues to be a very prominent Aboriginal activist. He started out in like the 70s. He was a big part of starting up the Tent Embassy, as well as the Black Power movement in Redfern, and also the Black Theatre. He was huge and continues to be such an influence. And I found this little book. It's literally 28 pages, and it's him talking about his own thesis that he wrote about Aboriginal history and about the politics particularly of the 60s and 70s and 80s that he participated in. And in this, he just sort of like talks over briefly some of the history that he participated in, but then also particularly he focuses on the importance and the validity of studying Aboriginal politics. He just has such a strong bite, wit, passion and humour in everything he does and says, and that is certainly true here. And then the book I finished last night is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe by Kawaguchi. This is the sequel, I suppose, or follow-up to Before the Coffee Gets Cold, which is a book I read a month or so ago and absolutely adored. It's the book that has made me cry most this year, so I was very much looking forward to the follow-up. As with the last book, we get 4 stories, and each and every one is told in such a simple, warm, big-hearted way that, I don't know, you just end up falling in love with everybody here. And I don't know, it feels so cozy, and yet it breaks your heart. And so I loved it. And then the Rumi Prescription, which is the book that we read for my Blossom Book Club over on the Patreon this month, and I loved this. This is a book by Iranian-American Muslim activist and author Melody Moeezy, and she basically has bipolar, and she experiences quite a severe episode of mania, after which she decides to sort of connect with her father, who has a love of Rumi and his poetry. And so basically she asks her father to teach her Rumi and to teach her the messages of Rumi. And so throughout this book, the chapters are basically separated into different diagnoses, or just like difficult emotions that Melody experiences, such as longing or anger, anxiety, depression, and for each she offers the Rumi prescription, and she just sort of like, it's a bit of a memoir as well, walking through a few years in the period of her life where Rumi really helped her heal, helped her reconnect with herself, what was important to her with writing, as well as with her cultural roots as well, and her family. And I will say I especially really loved and appreciated how Melody spoke about her bipolar experience, because I was worried a little bit going into this that it might romanticize the experience of bipolar and mental illness, which I think is hugely dangerous and damaging. But just the way that she sort of walked that line, to me, I felt like she really balanced that well, of being honest and true to her experience, which did bring her closer to her idea of God and divinity. But never like romanticizing bipolar or demonizing medication or treatment or anything like that. I don't know, to me this is something that I just really identified with and I found really beautiful and moving, and I think it was a vulnerable, honest gem of a book. And then my favourite book of the month, possibly my favourite book of the year, I'm not sure. I loved it anyway. It's Amrita by Banana Yoshimoto. This is the first book that I've read for my new Wild Book Box subscription. I am still working my way through that subscription and that vlog because all of the books that I was sent were huge. This was the smallest and it's 460 pages. Anyway, this is a book that's kind of about nothing and everything all at once. We follow a main character who has had quite a severe head injury, and before the book starts, she's also lost her sister and her father. And we are introduced to her and her family. It's quite an eclectic mix of family. Like, we have her mother and her brother, but then also like an aunt and a friend. They all live in this house, so they're a bit of an eccentric, quirky sort of collective. On top of that, it is a bit magical realism. There are ghosts in this story, and also the brother and a few other people are sort of like telepathic, but it's not really about any of that. It really is, it like zooms in on small moments between the big ones, and it's just the way that Banana Yoshimoto writes about them specifically that I found so engaging and beautiful. And I think in particular it's the way that she, I don't know, brings back everything feels like it comes back to two things: grief and love. It just feels like every single word is permeated with those two realities. And so it's at once the most beautiful and most heartbreaking thing I've ever read, even though nothing really happens. Now, I don't want to talk too much about it because already I've been sitting here for like an hour talking about books and my throat hurts, but also because I am doing a reading vlog, and so that will be up hopefully in a couple of weeks when I finally finish the other 2 books that I got. Safe to say, I adored this, and Banana Yoshimoto, I've read, 3 of her books now, and I've ordered 3 more because I just want to read them all. I'm obsessed. I loved this so, so much. So those are the 13 books that I managed to read in the month of July. I do feel like sitting here in this chair has definitely made me a lot more casual, so I hope this video comes across okay. Now I need to go take my puffer again and have a rest. So thank you so much for hanging out with me and chatting books. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I would love to hear in the comments below any of the books that you really enjoyed this month, and I will talk to you again in a video soon. So much love. Bye.